We're really excited to have here with us today Farid Lahoud, who is the Group Corporate Secretary of Bank Audi. In this capacity, his mission is to develop and implement and maintain a high-quality corporate governance framework for the bank and the group in general. He was appointed Group Secretary in 2006 and joined the bank in 1991. Farid Lahoud is a member of the Board of Directors of Bank Audi's investment bank, an investment banking subsidiary of Bank Audi. He has also served from 2013 to 2016 as a member of the Independent Expert Oversight Advisory Committee of the World Health Organization, WHO, then directing and coordinating authority for health within the United Nations. We're really excited for this keynote and what promises to be a very engaging discussion. And Farid, I'd like to invite you now to the stage, to the podium, to begin your talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Karine. Hi. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to speak at such a prestigious place in front of such a distinguished audience. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you for being still here at the end of this 3-day marathon. A very serious study by psychologists and conference organizers has demonstrated that audience attention jumps to its peak when the speaker says, "in conclusion." So since my conclusion is going to be very short, as you will see, I chose to start with these two words instead of concluding with them, and hence use your attention to deliver my speech rather than have it at its peak when you will be invited to take a break. Today I will talk to you about the governance challenges that the new generation of corporations will face. And I would like to engage with you in a reflection around the challenges of tomorrow's corporate decision-making in a world of a different order of magnitude, where expectations are high, risks are more unpredictable than ever, and failures have globally devastating impacts. Now, my presentation will be based on the experience of the financial and banking industry, because this is my background. But I like to think that a number of lessons or ideas can be easily exportable to other industries. I will not go into the details of what is meant by corporate governance, but let me just set the background by presenting the perimeter, so to speak, that the OECD uses to describe corporate governance. For the OECD, corporate governance involves the roles and relationships between a company's management, its board, its shareholders, and other stakeholders. It also provides the structure through which the objectives of the company are set and the means of attaining those objectives and monitoring performance are determined. And good corporate governance should provide proper incentives for the board and management to pursue objectives that are in the interest of the company and its shareholders, and should facilitate effective monitoring. The key aspect, if we were to select a few, would be for me the relationship between stakeholders, the means to set objectives and monitor performance, and the necessity to provide proper incentives to pursue corporate objectives. We can go back on any aspect of this at a later point, but you can easily imagine that these few words can be articulated interminably in a number of areas that include effective audit of management work, a rational organizational framework and performance evaluation, adequate risk management and oversight, strict compliance with laws and regulations, effective decision-making, proper succession planning, fair distribution of wealth, and management of conflicting interests. You can also think about adequate disclosure and transparency, about proper ways of setting policies and strategies, etc. So I'm going to show you a very quick illustration of what conflicts of interest may look like in a banking corporation, where you can easily imagine the radically opposing interests of stakeholders. And yet, the objective of a sound governance framework is to promote the interest of the corporation, not of any particular constituency, so that the conflicting interests converge into one, which is the perpetuation of the company as a successful corporation. The background having been set, let us look back at the recent history of corporate governance practices, again, mainly from a banking sector's perspective. Since the early 2000s, the world of finance is subject to regular crises, more or less severe, that pressures it to think itself, to rethink itself, to review the regulation that governs it, and to seek new protections. Among all these crises, 3 were particularly salient and can be qualified as earthquakes, given their economic impact and the introduction of new regulations or changes to existing regulations which followed. The first one is the crisis of the early 2000s, which was more or less directly the consequence of the bursting of the internet bubble. This crisis, as some of you may remember, was quickly associated with the names of 2 American giants, Enron and WorldCom, who were the first victims, or at least the most notable ones. It also caused the fall of Arthur Andersen, one of the oldest and most renowned external audit firms. The consequences of this crisis at the governance or regulatory levels were mainly a reinforcement of the legislation governing the audit of the firms, as well as the transparency and the reliability of their financial accounts, notably the American law of 2002 on the reform of the accounting of the listed companies and investor protection, better known as the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. This is why I like to refer to the early 2000s crisis as the audit crisis. The audit crisis continued to mark the world of finance and banking for many years, and was no doubt one of the incentives for the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision to publish a number of guides for the use of financial system actors, notably a more complete and articulated version of its recommendations for strengthening corporate governance in banks. Quickly enough, as you will remember also, a second earthquake of a greater magnitude began to shake the markets, with its epicenter at the very heart of the financial and banking system. This second crisis, which was known at its birth as the Subprime Crisis, gained momentum until it provoked a major financial crisis and a global economic one that began in 2008 and whose devastating consequences were felt for several years. The causes of this crisis, there are many, of course, but one point seems to emerge in a limpid way. Banks and the whole banking system in general have not recognized, have not identified, and did not measure properly the risks they carried in their books through assets and combinations of complex derivatives that they held and that proved toxic. Other players in the markets, like the regulatory authorities and the rating agencies, did not either. The banks realized too late that they had exposed themselves to risks they would not have wanted, risks that their capital did not adequately cover, risks that their managers and directors did not fully understand. This is why I like to refer to the subprime crisis from a governance perspective and the financial crisis of 2008 that succeeded it as the risk crisis. Like the audit crisis, the risk crisis provoked or accelerated the emergence of a new wave of regulations and principles, including an updated version in 2010 of the Basel Committee's recommendations on banking supervision for strengthening corporate governance in banking institutions. More recently, a new crisis is shaking again the world of finance and banking, a crisis that does not involve false accounts, such as the audit crisis, nor a lack of expertise like the risk crisis, but a crisis that has still nearly carried away, once again, several leading institutions of the global banking industry. A crisis having at its origin bad practices, malpractices or illicit manipulations, like the manipulation by Barclays and other banks of the panel of the Association of the British Bankers of the sacrosanct LIBOR rate, or circumvention of laws like the violation of embargoes by BNP, who had to pay a record fine amounting to nearly $10 billion, or help with tax evasion, money laundering, illicit offering or other practices that contravene the spirit, if not the text, of the laws and regulations. Hence, the designation of this third crisis as the compliance crisis. Like the previous two, the compliance crisis was followed or accompanied by even more regulations and recommendations, including a new version, reviewed and corrected once again, of the Basel Committee's recommendation for strengthening corporate governance in banking institutions, now called Principles of Corporate Governance for Banks. Despite the great differences between the three crises that we have just touched on briefly, an important element is common to them. This common element is the failure, each time, of the boards of directors of the companies that have been the victims to identify vulnerabilities in advance and to discover vulnerabilities in the framework of their internal control systems. This is a major gap, and many agree that the independent directors are primarily responsible for it, and that they could or should have been better informed, better engaged, or better prepared, or more competent. In short, they should have lived up to their missions to prevent certain practices, or at least to demand answers or to raise the alarm. Some go further by insinuating that what was lacking to independent directors, despite the fact that they met the criteria of independence, is precisely a certain desire for independence, a defect that has led too many to sacrifice their careers and reputations at the pyres of the CEOs. The independent directors, those strangers who are rarely seen on the covers of major magazines and who do not fascinate crowds, who are paid only minimally in comparison with their executive counterparts, they have become in a few years the guardians of good governance, to whom we ask so much, but to whom we give so little. So where are these newcomers in the agency relationship, and what is their value contribution? Before answering this question, let me reflect a little bit on the past crisis. Looking back, one can easily say that despite all the crises that we have faced, despite all the lessons that we have attempted to draw, despite all the regulations that we have introduced every time, and all the new enhancements to the governance frameworks that we have implemented, despite all that, our solutions do not seem to have prevented new waves of crisis. Of a different nature, granted, but still. Now, the Puritans among you may say that certain crises have probably been avoided, in fact, and that's why we don't know about them, precisely because they never happened. Of course, this is a debate we can engage in, but what is for sure is that the audit regulations did not prevent the risk crisis, and the risk regulations did not prevent the compliance crisis, and the compliance regulations will not prevent the next generation of crisis. The solutions that we have been implementing every time were tailor-made for the specific crisis that we had just faced. We have been reacting to every crisis with a plethora of regulations, with a plethora of policies, of standards we need to abide by, of tasks we need our board and our committees to fulfill. And my question today is, aren't we getting closer to saturating our boards? Aren't we saturating their capacity to think outside the box, their capacity to derive a vision in order to make sense of the world's evolution and of the overflow of information that modern corporations have access to in order to identify new opportunities? Isn't this approach to learning from the past putting our directors in a box with walls that are too thick for them to be able to think outside? In answer to regulation and to best practices, board packs are becoming bigger than ever. Board members are overloaded with repetitive information. Hundreds and even thousands of pages of regulatory information are put at the disposal of the board members, who should make sense out of it all. In order to take the appropriate decisions, regulatory tasks are more complex and time-consuming than ever. Tens, maybe hundreds of resolutions need to be adopted every year by the boards simply to tick boxes on regulatory checklists that are reminiscent of the past. And this takes a big portion of the board's attention and of the independent members' attention. Time they should have been able to use to think strategically, to preempt crises, to to search for opportunities and to derive vision. Remember that board time is probably the scarcest resource that is available to any corporation. And yet, there are indicators that we may be reaching saturation at the very moment where risks are going into a different order of magnitude. And what is additionally worrying is that we still have not been able to find a direct scientific link between all the enhancements that we have brought to what we call sound corporate governance and financial value in terms of net profit or stock price. We are still waiting to see a study that would prove that link exists. So what does this tell us in terms of our ways of dealing with crisis and about our ways of drawing lessons and implementing enhancements? So looking ahead, what are the solutions? How to empower the corporations to be able to face any type of risks? Not just risks that it has faced before, risks of an unknown nature, risks that are unpredictable in their essence. Traditional board decision-making has never before been put to the test with such unequaled challenges, where the number and complexities of variables is magnified by the need for agile and instantaneous actions. The accompanying increased regulations are having an additional adverse effect on decision-making processes, especially in large and complex entities, with an inability to measure the extent of their utility. The risks of resulting indecisiveness may be disastrous. Are committees, the way we have them today, still adapted to the needed enhanced pace for accountability, speed, and effectiveness, where a decision needs to be made faster than information can be reliably sourced, analyzed, or verified, and the consequences are entirely unpredictable? Are we going back to the intuitive leaders again, who can combine insight and instinct and make decisions amid uncertainty?
Today we are entering a new era, an era where beyond, and in addition to, the traditional inventory of risks, of a business, financial, operational, behavioral, or compliance nature, corporations are facing a new wave of risks. Risks that our existing corporate immune systems are not sufficiently equipped to fight. Risks such as megasystem failures, cyber risks, information overflow, systems opacity, undue sneaky influencing, climate change, terrorism, sustainability, global health threats, etc. But an era, also, where opportunities are huge and promising, opportunities that are exponentially increased by artificial intelligence, and by systems. Systems that do not get tired, or distracted, and that can increasingly take over any job, including that of a corporate secretary delivering a keynote address.
Well, not just yet, but thank you anyway for helping me make the point. Please meet Novot. This is Bank Audi's latest artificial intelligence robot. You can meet him at any of our branches if you ever come to visit us. So I guess the point is clear. What boards need in order to be able to face such risks and to equip their organizations to overcome them is a control vision at the top that is as strategic and as strong as the business vision of the CEO or of the executive team, and that complements it to allow adequate delivery of corporate results and perpetuation of corporate success. We need to assimilate the lessons of previous crises and integrate them into the corporation's instinctive pattern of behavior. I'm not saying that we should put down our guard in the front of potential audit wrongdoings or risk wrongdoings or non-compliance. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we need to digest the crises of the past. We need to digest the lessons drawn from these crises, integrate them in our instinctive system, put them aside, and free the mind of our boards and its capacity to think outside the box again, to be prepared to react quickly in cases of crisis, or even better, prevent new crises from happening. And we need to free their minds to be prepared to take new measured risks in order to benefit from opportunities and not fall in the trap of corporate hypochondria or corporate misophobia that would basically freeze any corporate progress and drive the corporation into a status of disastrous decision avoidance. We need them to be proactive into thinking of what is coming ahead, what is lying ahead of us in terms of challenges. We need also a new generation of independent directors. We go back to the independent directors who need to be the key contributors of a strategy of integrated controls, who will need to be able to oversee but largely delegate control-related judgment. They need to be able to delegate all compulsory control management in order to free their minds again and to rely on their business intuition. We will need a new generation of independent directors who can understand this. Independent directors who will have leadership skills of the type we traditionally expect from CEOs. We need an Elon Musk of governance or a Mark Zuckerberg of control. We need to stop thinking of independent directors as just nice to have to please the regulators or the market authority. We need to select them as we select CEOs and rely on them to be effective in our decision-making, effective in protecting us, effective in enhancing the control framework and accountability framework, just as we rely on the CEOs to be effective in business development, in growth strategy, and in operational efficiency. Traditional corporate governance practices have failed to sufficiently empower and sufficiently incentivize independent members, and the corporations were, as a result, not sufficiently demanding in their selection. This has led a number of business leaders to question their value contribution, including Warren Buffett, who has once described their contribution as minimal at best and too often negative, and who describes them as insufficiently knowledgeable or insufficiently interested. We need effective decision-making. Board members, executive and independent, have to work jointly as teams towards the same goals. We need reliable and effective information systems. The modern board needs to be able to identify and get the reliable, accurate, genuine, objective, and relevant information it needs for its decision-making, and this is not an easy task in the era of massive information sharing and of manipulated systems. I'm sorry about this slide. I asked my assistant to help me illustrate the complexity of decision-making. I guess she misunderstood me when I said that I will be speaking in front of a young audience. We need principle-based, objective-oriented regulation too. We need to reformat governance practices, and we need regulators and legal systems who can accompany such change and adapt the accountability framework accordingly. We need to rebuff the basic axiom that the boards can assimilate just any amount of information, that they can accommodate just any amount of regulation, that they can oversee the implementation of just any amount of standards. Finally, our board needs to strive for continued learning, just like any other individual corporate decision maker would. The last idea I would like to share with you is that a lot of research has gone into finding a link between sound corporate governance practices and financial performance, and no conclusive findings have been reached. I like to think that, just like the seatbelt in your car, sound corporate governance would not make you reach your targets more quickly or more effectively. It just simply limits the damages if you fail. So I personally see a sound governance framework under a strong, independent, and engaged board as a sort of intangible equity, a sort of tier zero equity, so to speak, that helps amortize the hit that the stakeholders would take in cases of failure. In conclusion, I would like to thank you again and to thank the organizers for the timing of my intervention and for using me as a warm-up for your Sunday night events.
And I would like to thank you too for having me. This has been the pinnacle of my career so far. And don't forget, hold on to your seats. This is going to rock.
Thank you very much. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Farid, for a very engaging conversation. I think there was two of you speaking, so it was not just you, but it was also Novat.
Yes, thank you for Novat also
So thanks,
for joining
Novat,
me.
for participating with us today in the discussion. I want to kick off with our first question, and then I'll hand it over to the audience, if that's okay with the different hands that I saw go up. In my capacity of advising the private sector and public sector, what I notice for shareholders and CEOs is a lot of decisions right now are gaining externalities in the society, which is adding a lot of risk. So we see the rise of social media being a driving force for civilian unrest, rising inequality. And so from what I understand from you, shareholders are having to think about a lot more things. So my question for you is, in the discussion of trade-off between gains to civil society, gains to the environment, gains to the people at large, how should shareholders think in this new world about managing profits and return of growth to their companies with the big decisions and risks that are out there that may affect their bottom line?
Well, thank you very much for that very interesting question. Definitely, the shareholders are one of the key stakeholders in a corporation. But as you just mentioned, they are not the only stakeholders. There are a lot of stakeholders that all have interest in the corporation and in the way the corporation is run and the impact of the corporation's decisions on their interest. So you're asking me about the specific role of the shareholders. If I can answer from the MENA region, I think that our shareholders generally, and not only the shareholders of Bank Audi, but the shareholders in the MENA region generally have yet to be more engaged into governance matters. They have to be more willing to look into the governance-related choices of their corporation, and they really need to look at corporate governance as I said, as a sort of free additional equity that they would have, so that they would question the board of directors and that they would question management on the decision they make on things that they deem of great value. Of course, things like impact on the environment or social responsibility or sustainability, these are very important matters. Shareholders should be putting pressure on the corporations to give due attention to these.
Thank you. I now open it up to the floor. I saw a hand go up.
My question to you is, when we talk about sound governance, which seems like enhanced control, shall we call it, what is the downfall of moving towards that direction, and what is the cost that we're trading off to get the benefits that you presented?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, sound corporate governance is very much about controls, but it is also about a very wide number of things. It's also about decision-making, about effective decision-making. And that's probably the key element that we sometimes tend to forget, that the rules to enhance corporate governance sometimes tend to put a little bit aside. We tend to give too much attention on what needs to be implemented in terms of control and and sometimes forget the importance of the sound governance framework in promoting effective decision-making, in empowering the boards, the 12 or 15 or 18 members sitting around the table to take the decision that is in the best interest of the corporation, taking the decision that will perpetuate the company as a successful corporation. So there is no, how did you call it, a fallback or a waste in implementing controls. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that we need our boards to have their minds free, to still have some capacity for new things that are happening. We are overloading them today with things that are the result of past crises. What I'm saying is that
corporations need to digest those things and to really bring them down into the instinctive way, a sort of instinctive way of behavior of the corporation, so that the board minds are freed for new challenges that are going to come, and for challenges that, as I have tried to show, are much more complex than what we have seen before. We will need to make sense more and more quickly of data and information of a size that we have never faced before. We will need to rely again on systems that we don't fully comprehend, and we may not be able to fully understand the systems that we will be relying on. So we need a completely different set of accountability framework. We need somewhere systems that allow us, as at the board level, to take a decision that is adequately supported by valid and reliable information. We will continue to be accountable. True, no vote may take a lot of jobs, and artificial intelligence over the coming 10 or 20 years, if you want my opinion, yes, they will take a lot of jobs that are not only repetitive or mechanical jobs. No, a lot of jobs that are increasingly relying on intelligence. But for the time being, at least, humans, the brains of our members of the board, still need to remain free to make the final call, the final decision about what is good or what is bad, about what interest to preserve and which way to take. So this is what I'm saying. Just free our minds to be able to make those decisions.
So Bank Audi is a public company, right? And essentially, my first question is, how do you engage your shareholders in discussions, and how do you bridge the gap between the shareholders and the board, especially in a country like Lebanon, where shareholders in general are more disconnected from the board? And my second question is, how do you show to shareholders what you're trying to change on the board, and how does this create value for them? How do you show them this? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. How do we engage our shareholders, and how do we show them value? Well, first of all, we have, as Bank Audi, tried to be at the forefront of pioneering corporate governance enhancements. I do invite you to visit our website, and to visit especially the corporate governance page of our website, where we have a number of disclosures. We have an investor-related presentation that is published on our website too, and that is updated quarterly, and that show genuinely to our shareholders the path that we are taking, the choices that we are making, and the objectives that we are pursuing. In our annual report to the General Assemblies and to the public at large, we publish our annual report ahead of the General Assemblies, like all public entities do, but we have an extensive discussion of the risk that we are facing, of the objectives that we are setting for ourselves, and we encourage shareholders to come and basically attend the General Assemblies and challenge and ask questions. Now, I have to be to clarify one point. Like many, and as I said before, like many other companies in the MENA region, the shareholders of Bank Audi are sometimes not engaged enough into holding the board accountable or into pressuring the board to go into one direction or the other. That's a bit unfortunate. I mean, we do have, of course, a sufficient amount of shareholder interaction, but we would like to see more. We would like to see our around 2,000 or 2,500 holders of shares and global depository receipts of the bank to be interested in the choice that we are making more explicitly, and to be really more active rather than just looking at the financial performance. But I think that this is more of a culture in the MENA region that we still need to work on. Unfortunately, maybe because the direct link between, as I said, between sound governance and financial performance has not yet been established, and I don't think it will ever be established. Just like you will never be able to say that if you put your seatbelt, you will get to where you're going more quickly. You will not. If you don't, your risks are more limited. The overall control framework of your car, the seatbelt, the brake, etc., they work against you. The brake would make you go slower, but it would prove very useful, of course. So chances are companies with no governance at all, with like, one man show or one man decides all. A number of those may be very successful. Chances are the probability of failure would be higher for them too. Chances are that person who's making the call would make them at the end for his own personal benefit rather than for the benefit of all the other stakeholders. But from the face of it, you may see a successful company that is very badly governed.
I think we have time for one more question.
To me, I believe that a significant component of sound governance is having a great human capital management. So when it comes to employees and maybe those who are not very high in the hierarchy of the corporation. So I'm curious to know, how do you think you can reassure your employees that they have secured careers with Bank Audi, for example, and they're not threatened by Novot or any robot that might replace all bank tellers, for example?
Okay, if you want some detailed answer, I would invite you to visit our stand at the fair just a few minutes later, where we'll have our colleagues from HR who will be here and who will be able to answer you. What I can tell you from a governance perspective, and this you may not like, is that of course human resources are the most valuable assets. Of course, these are human resources is a main concern for the board, but human resources are not the only stakeholders. I'm not saying that we would sacrifice human resources well-being purely and only for profit. This is not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that we need to look also at the overall sort of, the chart that I showed you in the beginning. Human resources employees are one of the many stakeholders in that corporation. So we do need to motivate them. We need to promote a culture of meritocracy, a culture of fair remuneration, but at the same time a culture of risk-based remuneration, a culture of, again, fair remuneration, not just making everyone feel good because we're in a all-winner situation. It's a business and it has to survive, and in order to survive, there are certain things that need to be happening and certain equilibrium that have to be maintained. In terms of what risks our human resource, but having said this, we're very proud to be the employer of choice in Lebanon, and I think that if you ever come and visit us at Bank Audi, you will probably, if you could measure the level of happiness or fulfillment or motivation of our employees, you would probably see a very high level of that, and we're very proud about it. In terms of what risks are they facing and whether Novot is going to take them, we have always had a culture at Bank Audi where if you're good at something and you stop at it just because you're very good at it, and you're excelling it, and you just hold on to it, well, chances are you will stay where you are for the rest of your career and you will not advance. If you're good at it, teach someone else and move on to do something else. And this has been the sort of HR culture that we have at Bank Audi. It's the same with artificial intelligence. It is an opportunity as much as a threat. It's a threat for someone who wants to stay where he is, to stop where he is and say, okay, I have an expertise, I'm going to hold on to it, and I'm going to sell it to my employer for the rest of my career. This is not the proper way of doing it. Artificial intelligence is a great opportunity. It can be used for you rather than being viewed as a threat to you.
Thank you very much, Farid, and thank you for being with us here today. And now we conclude our keynote, and we have a small token of appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Here you go.
Thank
Thank you very much for being with us today. And Anthony has joined us.